welcome to the M.A.D Generation podcast. Today we have on a very special guest, André Corrêa de Almeida, who was my professor at Columbia for a very interesting class that we'll get into. But today it is also sad. We usually have Sophia on, the three of us, but today it's just going to be me and Devon. Devon, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Devon. I'm one of the co-hosts with Mia and Sophia, and I'm happy to be here to meet Andre for the first time.
Likewise.
Andre, Andre is a professor at SIPA, and he taught this really interesting class called Urban Analytics and Human-Centered Decision-Making. And a lot of urban planning students took it, and other students from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, I believe. De Almeida, sorry. Is that how you pronounce your name? De Almeida?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay,
but André is fine as well.
Okay. Yeah, and you also do quite a couple of other, you have a couple other like nonprofits and other things that you've started, which I would love for you to talk about later in just a second. But I first wanted to provide a little bit of a story of, or not a story, but just some background with this class that was so memorable to me. And also, I mean, I've already told you this story as well, Andre, but my dad, for Christmas, before even coming to Columbia, he got me a book that was your book, and I had no idea it was even your book, and I just ended up signing up for your class, and then I made that connection, and it was just really special. But yeah, in this class, we had this really wonderful opportunity to make a transparency dashboard for the municipality of Rio de Janeiro. And Andre kind of guided me and a team of students to help kind of create a prototype for a platform that would organize and visualize and just facilitate the process of data sharing, data that's related to city government. So yeah, that was a really wonderful experience. Do you have any like favorite aspects of that project or anything that you want to continue working on in terms of like government data transparency?
Well, something that I love in the classes I organize, and frankly, that's why I do it that way, is the focus on practice and client relations. So it's very important for me that students apply what they learn in the classroom environment into real world problems and really specific needs that clients/partners want to address. That's actually the only way to have a very strong buy-in from the client/partner side. So that focus on practice is it's always very important. And then the degree of students' commitment is also something that is very important for me. And it was my first experience teaching at GSAPP, and once again, I was incredibly. I should not say surprised, but I'll say it because it was the first time, and we never really know what to expect. But the level of commitment, engagement, and professionalism of students was incredible.
It was a wonderful experience. First, before we get into the heart of the conversation, there is a question that we always start with. Maybe, Devon, you want to ask?
Oh, yeah. So Generation M.A.D is a double entendre, meaning a generation who believes that we are all living in a world of mutually assured destruction, or that we believe as a generation, as a current society, we can actually make a difference towards the existential crisis that is climate change, as well as just the future issues that we may progress into beyond climate change. And along kind of the spectrum of total, apathy and thinking that like the world is falling apart, and like optimism for the future, and like what we can kind of do as a society as a whole, where do you find yourself? And how do you kind of like see our future endeavors?
Well, I clearly see myself as a optimistic with method, optimistic with the method. I mean, we have incredible development challenges, but I always like to think of development from an historical perspective. And I think it's unquestionable that we've come a long way in the last 100 years, or 200 years or 300 years, in terms of economic development, in terms of urban sustainability, in terms of human rights, even in terms of now more recently, at least more explicitly in terms of diversity and inclusion. So I tend to use history as a source of inspiration, frankly. And this is actually a topic that I was not very keen of when back in school, back in high school. And I never really had a good relationship with history and languages. And here I am. I've been a expatriate, Portuguese expatriate for more than 50% of my life, where languages and communications play such an important role. So clearly, I'm on the optimistic side, but optimistic with a method, meaning the optimism is grounded on the evidence that we've been able to do incredible, amazing things throughout history. And my hope is that we will be able to address the 21st century challenges, including climate change, gender inequality, racial inequality, biodiversity. But it's collective action takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and we're learning. And to a very large extent, we are very very rudimentary, frankly. I mean, we like to think of us as these very advanced 21st century beings, living beings. But again, from an historical perspective, there's a lot in terms of breaking the silos. There's a lot in terms of how much we can learn, how our brains work, how we can fight fear, mitigate biases. So I very often see myself looking at the human experience from a very, very, very humble standpoint. We've come a long way, but we are very, very basic still.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of one thing, like through more at the beginning of our show, we kind of had conversations that were very dismal, and we kind of had lost. That's kind of why this podcast started. We were very depressed about the fact that we were inheriting an environment that seemed like there was no way out of actual just mass destruction. Like, as an environmental studies major and learning about disaster after disaster, it really seemed like there was no hope. But after more conversations and conversations like this, it's I don't know if, Devon, you feel this way, but I really do feel like, I mean, maybe from a practical place, we can't afford to not be optimistic, but there also is a lot of reason to, take on this challenge in kind of an optimistic perspective.
Yeah, optimistic does not mean lunatic or crazy or unreasonable. For me, optimistic means that we look at where we came from in terms of data, what we've established, what we accomplished, and use that to find new ways to address some of our current problems. And in mind that the dilemmas and the frustrations that you just expressed, Mia, have been felt by other generations. Look at the Second World War generation, and then the First World War generation. And then back in the 19th century, all the traumas around French revolutions and the revolution, civil war in the US, in America, and we should not hope to remove struggle, individual and a collective struggle, from our lives. I don't think that will happen in the next 1,000 of years. But I remain hopeful because, what I just said.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from your also perspective earlier when you were talking about method, there's a scientific approach to that. There's a basis for the decisions that you make, or the decisions made in general, I would say. And I think that transfers over to your focus, which is very data driven, architecture of data, I would almost say, from reviewing a lot of your work. But for our audience who aren't as familiar with some of the stuff you've done, would you mind kind of giving a brief overview of some of the projects you worked on, what your like field of study is in your minds, and like how you kind of bring that into practical society and the projects you work on?
Great question. So I think a key driver of my work is the belief that we need to work together. And this seems very, quixotic, very naive. But institutions and status quo are very resilient. A law that was brought in last year or 10 years ago will tend to be resilient. So laws and institutions tend to be resilient once they are implemented. And to change them, you really need a coalition of minds and a coalition of interests to make that shift, whether in terms of education policy, whether in terms of climate change, whether in terms of even basic management issues in your building or co-op or condo. So the question is then, how do you make these connections and these bridges? How do you bring people together to make decisions in the direction that you want? So that's when I think data plays a very important role, and a sort of a more rational approach to the problems we have. And why is data important? It's not so much because it's unquestionable, because we all have issues with the data sources more than ever. We all have issues with even if the data source is legitimate, we may have issues with the quality of data. But at least with data, we can have a more specific set of variables in which to ground our assumptions. And very quickly, you will be hearing me talk about communication as well, because so many of the problems that we face these days, and you don't have to go into international affairs to know that, between friends, between family members, between neighbors, there's communication gaps becoming so problematic because we don't have time to listen, we don't have time to think about things. And again, I know that I'm saying very trivial aspects of how we have our lives currently organized, but this is my passion. My passion is to look at data through scientific lens and then engage folks around. Not to say that data will be sort of a gospel that will determine decision without further reflection, but at least data allows us to formulate assumptions around which we can have conversations. And that's, I think, it's missing in most of the cases. We cannot even bring people together around the table to discuss certain issues. So data is sort of a kind of this mediator of relationships. It's middle ground between complete subjectivity and extreme rationality that, by the way, does not exist.
Yeah, and in the way this word integrity in relationship to thinking about data, we have very sophisticated data sets and systems of data, and I think you really hit a key point there, kind of like the communication, and this was also related to our Rio transparency dashboard. We have a lot of the time we have the data, but it's not being effectively communicated or shared across groups that can really make powerful and effective maybe like policies or whatever it is using the analysis from that data. And it's obviously, this is another kind of scary part. Like, data can be interpreted and taken out of context, and it's just so capable of really incredible, effective things, and can also, if it's taken into the wrong hands, can kind of go in a scary direction. What does integrity mean to you in the context of thinking about data?
But to your point, Mia, precisely, that's why before I mentioned that I think data and these more scientific methods or approaches are mostly useful not to make decisions per se immediately. I think they should be embraced to initiate conversations. And the drama, but also the optimistic side of things, is that so often everyone would be better off if that type of conversation could happen, but just it's not happening. So I work mostly at two levels, my research agenda. One is about innovation in the urban sector, innovation in urban systems, how technology and data interact with organizational structure and institutional settings, mostly around the issue of how city agencies innovate. And actually, we are finalizing a new case study on how the city of New York innovated through times of crisis, through COVID times. But my other stream of research is about institutional reform at national level in Portugal, my home country. And a survey I ran a few years ago regarding the reform of the electoral law showed that all parties, and the Portuguese parliament has 230 members, that there were, in spite of the fact that there were 7 parties in the parliament, there was no statistical significant differences regarding the willingness to change the electoral law. So everyone wants to change a very old electoral law for the parliament that we have in Portugal. But that change did not happen yet. Isn't that fascinating that everyone in the group wants to change something, but then the change does not happen because there are these nuances in perspective that are never being able to be breached. And so we remain with the status quo that is less optimal for everyone. I think this is a fascinating type of dilemma and challenges that we face. So, to some extent, part of my hope comes from the belief that there's much more uniting us, that's much more in common among us than it seems. It's just that we have not been very smart creating the conversations, the negotiations, the conflict resolution strategies. I stop here.
I mean, would you say that there's then this dual-pronged issue that you've kind of pointed at, which is one, as Mia presented earlier, the actual ways of distributing and presenting data, and then the other one is when that data actually is translated into a means that is easy for public discourse or for some kind of general debate, that there isn't a reason for people to have that conversation, or there isn't really a medium, like a forum by which data can truly weigh when it is provided. I think it's interesting because New York also is one of the highest or has some of the best data out of all cities in the US. And I'm not sure about globally, but I know it's definitely up there. But I'm sure even then there's problems with like having people participate in the right way, like actually paying attention to the information, even when you make it so easy to understand.
Yeah, you have a point, but let's not forget that this is all very new. I mean, since when do we have big data type of issues? I mean, since we have cell phones and and much faster computers exist to process all this information. So let's say 15 years at most 10, 15 years, right? So that brings us to 2005. I mean, of course, we've been using email since 95, 94, early 90s, but this issue of amount of data only became much more salient in the past 10 years. So maximum 15. So we're still learning. And I think, frankly, all the conversations that we need to have are happening. We're talking about data reliability, we're talking about data ethics, we're talking about data bias, we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about the rights of individuals to their data. We're talking about regulating the social media space. I think all those conversations are happening. So I think we need to be able to do two things. We need to be able to be highly invested and be concerned with these problems, but we also need, so suggests and requires a bold attitude. I like to tell my students that we are not observers. We are participants. We are active participants in the game. But we also need, I think, to realize that not everything will be fixed in our generation. Mm-hmm. And this is something that is kind of new, because back in the 60s and back in the 70s, maybe the 60s and the 70s started to make a little bit of a transition to more of like an on time, right now, immediately time of change. I mean, mostly around the issue of the Vietnam War and take them out of Vietnam. So that, not long ago, it seems for both of you, it seems like an eternity ago. But that's like, 50 years ago. It's not half a century. It's not, a significant amount of time. So I think we need to feel more comfortable with the fact that not all changes will happen in our generation, as it was the case in previous generations. And to some extent, we are in a privileged position because more things are happening in our generation than before.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm scared of personally, I totally think everything you are saying is correct. I just know that, big data, corporations like Google, Amazon, etc., it's still so new. Exactly what you said. It's still so new that a lot of it is unprecedented in, for example, the way, predictions are made off of data. Also, things like Link NYC, I read that in your book. Fascinating topic. There's kind of been a back and forth conversation about, the data security involved with the Link NYCs. As I don't, and thinking about corporations and Amazon and Google, it's like, it's so unprecedented that we don't know what's happening. But I have I'm scared that it's very asymmetrical in terms of what we know and what we just think is, inevitable because it's unprecedented and it's still so new. But the people who are developing these mechanisms do know. Maybe they don't know what's going to happen. How do you suggest? I'm someone who really is fascinated by technology and innovation, and what your book, Smarter New York City, kind of gets at is like the rhetoric of saying innovation and government are inherently incompatible topics, which is actually language that furthers that problem. Like, just by saying that they don't go hand in hand at all, like, it actually makes that a reality even more. And it's important to bring into discourse and to challenge government and really encourage government to think outside of the box and create these systems where government can adapt and change. How do you suggest we can kind of hold big data accountable and kind of maybe reclaim some of this data for the people, instead of kind of feel like it's a big unknown and kind of sometimes feel withdrawing from this whole system because it's so unprecedented and so large and kind of hard to think about in very tangible terms. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I would just invite you to reconsider the idea that is unprecedented. Yes, computers are unprecedented and big data per se is unprecedented, but power inequality and concentration of power is not at all unprecedented. And we have several examples of how in the past, and by the way, I strongly encourage you and your audience to watch The Man That Built America. I don't like the title because it emphasizes only man, but it is the story of 5 men, and I'm sure there would be other equally number of powerful women to work on, to study and learn about. But this particular History Channel series, The Man That Built America, tell the story of how the Rockefeller the Vanderbilt, Rockefeller with oil, Vanderbilt with the train system, the railroad system, Henry Ford with automobile industry, J.P. Morgan Chase with the banking, and Andrew Carnegie with the iron empire that he created. In all cases, monopoly was dismantled in the early 20th century, and we are already having conversations of that type regarding these incredible amounts of power that a few have. So I trust that society and legislators will think wisely and act and decide wisely. I mean, am I being naive? I mean, I don't think I am, because in the past we were able to do that, and the same happened with telecommunications, by the way, with the entire Bell, empire at one point. So that's for me a sign of hope, and it's not really totally unprecedented, that type of power. Regarding the more widespread inequality, I'm a little bit less optimistic about the inequality issue. What I hope is that inequality will continue to increase, I think, and the inequality gap will continue to further increase. My hope is that the bottom levels will be able to move up. And China, frankly, and India did a great job in the last several decades regarding that aspect of social. They talk about, they like to use the metaphor of social elevator. So I'm giving you some insights, more optimistic insights, less optimistic insights. But even in the last optimistic insights, I think inequality will continue to expand, but the base will go up, which ultimately will allow better living conditions for everyone.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely like a very interesting problem, because there's the issue of, if you have these amalgamations of information, yes, they're more efficient systems as you scale, economies of scale. There's economic theory behind that. But then there's also the problem of, if you have a very small pool of people who control so much information, then it becomes more and more like a cartel every day between monopolies, where we might have oligopolies instead of monopolies, like we kind of do now, where it's like 5 companies that each rely on each other for a very important thing. One does the internet, one produces the devices, the other one runs the applications, where we kind of see that with like an Amazon, Google, Apple, Facebook, Meta now. But the question of the balancing act of that, like, if the government breaks up applications, if the government breaks up companies, if data that is publicly accumulated should be dispersed back to the public, like what kind of transparency is there? And that's where it becomes really interesting when we talk about architecture too, where now we're almost shifting into this ephemeral world where we had physical spaces, and now digital spaces are becoming created just purely out of the data that we consume and collect and disperse into these digital ecosystems. And like you said, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Not everything's going to happen in this generation. But how do you visualize the future of data transparency in these like virtual ephemeral spaces? Not saying like something that you can visualize, but just purely like if you're talking about graphs or any other way of kind of storing personal data and translating it across the internet, like how would you kind of project out into the future what that will look like?
Well, I think data literacy will be something that will clearly improve. Mm-hmm. We will all become more familiar. Even I mean, I never thought of having conversations with computer scientists or data scientists for my own work. I'm a social scientist. At most, I would work, even working with lawyers, it seemed very distant from me. I've come from a tradition where economists and managers, like folks with a degree in economics and a degree in management, were like these completely different entities. You have to pick one school or the other. I mean, now it's just like the same. Do you really make a distinction between economists and businessmen or women? Well, maybe if you are a theorist, theorist in economic field, you'll be a little bit more apart from the others. But we are all becoming more familiar with data. We are all becoming more familiar and even connected professionally with data scientists, computer scientists, those folks that design and build those weird and strange things. So I think again, back to communication, back to teamwork and coordination, multidisciplinary teams will help address so many of those issues. And I mean, look, if you use the Google tools that allow you to search for certain keywords over time. I mean, if you search for words such as data ethics or ethical algorithm or people empowerment, these types of very powerful and like keywords, you will see that the movement is happening in the right direction. So if we bring together higher degrees of data literacy, I think your generation, and of course we do not belong to the same generation, unfortunately for me, but your generation, I argue, is much more generous than our generation in terms of how much importance you play to the common good. Your generation, and maybe actually the generation before yours, are viewed as being very atomistic, very cell phone oriented, Instagram, the whole gaming industry. But I don't think that's a complete story. So, and you can even see that with the numbers of hours and days a year that one dedicates to volunteering work. Those numbers are growing, not in all countries equally, but the challenges are there. But I know where I was going in my conversation. So data literacy among the population will help us all be better part of the conversation. And look on the legislative side. Look at the campaigns. Look at the town halls conversations. Look at the platforms with which new mayors are being elected. It's about privacy, it's about data, it's about racism, it's about gender equality. I think, frankly, I know that things take time, and the drama here is that technology and the private entrepreneurship is moving faster than the public, legislator. Mm-hmm. That does not mean that the legislator is not in the right direction, but that's true. We have to find ways to equip our elected officials and their teams with, I don't have a solution for that. Maybe through better integration of the public and the private, and more dialogue between the public and the private sector to help bridge the gap. I'm throwing some ideas.
Yeah, and on that topic of just data literacy is really interesting. I think the Internet of Things has really democratized access. Like, for example, the GameStop situation when, just normal, I kind of forget, what was that term? Like what the economic...
The people on Reddit, you mean? The retail investors were just all...
Yeah, forget what the economic term was, what happened.
The short squeeze. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. But basically, you no longer have to go to business school and get this fancy degree to participate if you have the internet and if you have these forums where people can come together. it's kind of like this democratized access to information and knowledge. And this is something I've really been thinking about in a city context and urban planning context. It's technology's ability to decentralize power and allow people to participate in processes just by mere internet connection. And, with COVID, the COVID pandemic, and things like renewable energy, we see centralized systems kind of starting to disperse out. We have, renewable energy, like solar panels, solar energy no longer is, just like centralized power generators. Like the system of energy is spreading out, and with remote work. And this is something I've been thinking about in an urban planning context. Cities are kind of starting to, people don't need to be so clustered. There's not really as much of a need to gather in the urban sphere so much as they used to. Do you think that, what is your, like, how do you think data and decentralizing technology, like that trend, kind of that evolution of technology and that progression, do you think that will change our cities in like more of like a more physical, structural way? Do you think people will kind of start to leave cities, or do you think that the cities will stay, or maybe just new ones will be created more easily?
Yeah. Well, I hear you. It's a fascinating question because, and COVID offers an unprecedented opportunity to study. Maybe in 10 years, we'll be in a position to look back and see what happened. And that's when we'll be better able to answer your question. But just by looking at our own individual behavior, it's unquestionable that organizations need less space. Varies from sector to sector. For example, at Columbia, we need the same amount of things because we desperately want to be on campus. The students want to be on campus. They want to learn in person. Faculty needs to be on campus to teach the classes in person and interact with the students and with the colleagues. So the need for space, the need for a physical presence will vary across sectors. But I think overall, it's fair to say that there will be less infrastructure pressure in the main urban settings. But why do I say main urban settings? Because one could then argue that these folks, all these thousands of people, will now spend more time in other places that they want to be, by the ocean, in the mountain, in the countryside, with their families, I don't know, by the river. So again, it's with some optimism that I see an opportunity here to decentralize location, and that may help trigger development in areas less obvious because with less of a dynamic in terms of population. And again, back to the idea of, so that addresses the idea of decentralization a little bit. Back to the idea of data skills, I think that we have no other way than be more participants. And I think the political parties are feeling that. This is just not something that is sort of a kind of a grassroots movement that no one is really paying attention. Look what happened at the institutional level, just with the Black Lives Matter movement, and and together with the Me Too movement. I mean, there are fundamental institutional changes happening because of the engagement with people participation, and let alone with climate change as well. I think if we look at data as the 21st century oil, data together with these decentralization trends can certainly, I believe, help distribute power, has the potential to help address some of our inequality issues.
Yeah, when you said, when you're talking about people living in different places, kind of a distribution of habitation around the world, it actually made me think of an OMA exhibit that was curated by Rem Koolhaas at the Guggenheim back in 2020 called Countryside: The Future, about how even though people have amalgamated more and more in cities and passed the thresholds where over 51% of the world's population, or majority of the world's population, lives in urban environments, the space that has been changing more has actually not been cities, but has been the countryside, because data centers have been constructed, farms have been augmented, as well as all these other topographical shifts in the environment that surround cities. And I think it's interesting to discuss about also how, though we have all these digital infrastructures and they seem like it's this totally different thing that we only interface with through a device or a computer, they also do augment our physical space and our physical reality as well. They're not just these like invisible things that we never interact with. There's huge infrastructures that are supplied around these. And I remember Mia earlier today when we were having a discussion was talking about security infrastructure, for example, around Colombia. And that itself is a physical typology of being observed by this Internet of Things. And I was wondering if you could talk about that for a bit too, just like the physical space of the Internet and data.
Can you formulate your rationale around like a specific question? I just want to address.
Oh yeah, no, of course. Like, how do you see the infrastructure that facilitates these digital environments and like the distribution of this information shaping the lived reality that we are confined in? For example, an architecture question could be, do you think that security and surveillance will end up dictating the way that streets are formed as to make it easier to watch people, and things like that? Like, do you see environments changing to meet data collection needs rather than the methods of collecting data shifting to meet society's needs?
Well, one could say that security is a society need, right? So I think, Rousseau was one of the first to talk about the social contract. So I think, again, the nuances of the problem may be different, but it's not a new problem. It has always been the struggle to find the balance between individual liberties, individual freedom, and society cohesion. And we all appreciate that we have cameras in certain cross sections, right? We all appreciate. I mean, frankly, we may, if we are landlords or board of directors in the building, we may advocate for more cameras in our block. I think this brings us to an idea that we haven't discussed yet today, which is trust. And trust, it's implicit in how you bring people together. It's implicit when you talk about negotiations, which we talked about. It's implicit when you talk about conflict resolution. It's been implicit in our conversation. And I always like to talk about neuroscientists and psychiatrists and psychologists that so often are left outside of these development conversations and these public policy conversations. We tend to think of these, professionals and specialties as belonging to the realm of only very advanced labs or individual offices. Well, we need to bring them to the conversation. We need to understand much better how our brains work. We need to understand much better what helps me connect with one person and not connect with the other. We need to understand how better our biochemistry works, because that ultimately affects how we react to actions and how we react to events, how we react to things you may tell me. And that seems very microscopic, but that's actually where magic starts to happen, when 2 or 3 or 4 persons come together, or how 2 or 3 persons break apart. So at the society level, if we can think if we can think of a future where citizens trust their city officials, their representatives, if they can really trust in ways that it was not yet achieved. But there are cases around the world where that happened. Very charismatic leaders I remember during the Soviet Union Revolution, very charismatic leaders in Poland and Czech Republic, and then later South Africa. More recently, a very charismatic prime minister in Canada and Japan. So that is possible, to have that type of bond between legislator and citizens. The second thing is that we need to feel comfortable with the fact that legislators represent a very large number of people, and that very large number of people may be organized in different types of groups of interest. Mm-hmm. So we have to feel comfortable, but that in some case the decision may come to my side. In other cases, the decision may not be in my favor. But if trust is there, I don't know if citizens, I don't know if we, the people, will ever be able to participate in all types of problems that the society faces. We need to trust in groups. We need to trust in certain research centers to advocate for us in certain directions. We need to trust in certain advocacy groups in some other direction. We need maybe trust in political parties to further push the agenda in other directions. So I don't know. I'm not answering your question directly. I don't know in which direction we will end up moving. I hope that trust will make us all feel more comfortable with who we elect to run our public systems. But I always go back. Let me repeat myself here a little bit. Let's think historically. Let's think of so many of the dilemmas faced in the 20th century, and 19th century, and 18th century. And how we were able to address it. Health. Look at the incredible health standards we have globally. Child mortality is like historical low levels. Life longevity. I mean, incredible, unprecedented achievements in the health sector. But then you tell me, well, sure, but that brings lots of pressure to our public finances, because now we have to fund those that are living more years and not paying taxes, perhaps. Well, we were able to find solutions in the past. I do not want to forget that in this process, many people suffer. So don't misunderstand me. Schumpeter was the first to talk about creative destruction. So there's lots of suffering in spite of our optimism. There are companies that bankrupt. There are people in middle class and low middle class of all social stratas that lose their jobs. There are folks that lose their lives and their families, and they know that it's tragic. The human experience is tragic to some extent. So I want to acknowledge that suffering and that destruction that Schumpeter talks about. I think the question today is more of a global level. Mm-hmm. As a collective, past, present, and future, where are we heading to? And that's where I have a more positive attitude, albeit recognizing very large amounts of suffering and loss in the process.
Yeah, and continuing to think in that global context. I know you've done a lot of work outside of the US, which is very, I would love to hear more about that, as someone who, I feel like the urban planning education that I get is very New York City centric. Is there some sort of innovation or government systemic process, maybe in Portugal, that they do differently and you think is really important to implement here? you have this really important perspective. You have the U.S. understanding and international. Is there any maybe advice for like future urban planners or people who want to work in the government to kind of look internationally for inspiration or some sort of guidance that you think is important to bring here?
Well, when I try to simplify the comparison between my European experience and my Portuguese experience, in Europe, I've lived in two countries, Portugal and the Netherlands, and 4 years in China as well, and lots of time spent in Africa as well. But when I make the comparison between, I don't want to say Europe and the US because Europe is very large, but when I make the comparison between Portugal and the US, I say the following. In the US, relationships are mediated by institutions, laws, policies, best practices, courts. That's the relationship between people. Where I'm coming from originally, the main mediator of relationship is affection between people. Well, there's pros and cons in both cases. When you have a society mostly mediated by affection, what you have is very, very, very strong social ties that more often than not binds you. More often than not constrains you because of the group pressure and expectations that others have on you. And it also creates issues of nepotism and rampant corruption because of the social ties that drive so much of how society works. Mm-hmm. Well, but then in the case of a disaster, of an extreme circumstances, you have the core of the family to bring you back to, and it's interesting that during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, there was very little extreme suffering in Portugal. You didn't see like a larger number of homeless in the streets. Of course, people lost their jobs, but they had a family to go back home and to support them. In the US, the experience is different. Very, very different. In the US, institutions are mediated, or organizations and relationships between organizations and persons are mediated through best practices, rules in place, courts, contract, enforcement of contracts. And so what my recommendation is that to a large extent, even though the the North American experience is much more rooted in grassroots movement in civil society, which Europe does not have that tradition. I think there's a natural more openness in Portugal to listen to their constituents. In the US, and talking about the urban space and urban innovation and urban systems, because society is organized in very strong groups. There's a coalition for this, coalition for that, association for this, association for that, much more than in Portugal. I argue that you lose a little bit the sense of citizenship. You lose the sense of people. You lose a sense of plaza, to use architecture terminology. Anyway, so this is the lens of institutions and affection really helps me to understand some of the very important differences between how elected officials deal with their constituents on both sides of the Atlantic. I feel like I went in multiple different directions, but I think it all boiled down to the idea of participation. I think participation in the North American experience is much more. It has to be by design. You need in more traditional environments such as Portugal, it's a country with almost 1,000 years of old. The relationships are more embedded in the texture. I'm not saying it's necessarily better or worse. As I mentioned, issues of corruption, nepotism, conflict of interest is rampant in these types of contexts.
No, but that makes a lot of sense to kind of draw the comparison as a result of the age of these societies and also like the structures, where you can almost imagine a lot of developing countries now, because of all the innovations and the way that societies have shifted, that their next generations will have totally different relationships than their ancestors did, especially if they were taking over new territory like the US started with. But overall, since we don't have much time left, and I'm not sure if Mia, would you like to put another question in? Because I have one. Well, just to kind of finish out this talk with one last question, do you see, because obviously everything can be framed within the discourse of like social governance and sustainability nowadays, because there's a place for everything. But do you see a future where data can be used, and you've kind of vocalized this before, but used in a framework that is more viable for transparency, openness, and
Absolutely.
a social governance framework? Yeah. And how would you see that being incorporated on like a governmental level?
Yeah, that's going to be the main transformation, frankly. It's not going to be so much at technological level or sizes of farms transform into servers, hosts. There has to be a fundamental change in data governance.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know exactly how it's going to end up looking at the end, but one thing I know for sure, the conversations that we need to have are happening. Okay. And are happening at all levels, and in all countries, in all continents, in all regions. Are happening at the at the civil servants level, at legislators, academia, civil society. It's just not any more sustainable to have my own private data being monetized by others. But look, some arrived first. There were some that found the solution first, and they should be rewarded. Frankly, Mike Zuckerberg thought of that, and then others have complementary ideas. So I'm fine when, in the relatively short amount of time, you have these super winners, right? We had in the past the Rockefellers with the oil, the Vanderbilts with the railroad system. I mentioned, and Andrew Carnegie with the iron empire, Henry Ford with the automobile industry. I'm okay with that, but data will the ways we organize our data. Some conversations, some schools of thought talk about these third-party NGOs or these third-party repositories that have data. I think about an institution that you would trust. I kind of lost a little bit the train of thought, and so I found it. So you have the where you put the data, who hosts the data, and then who's going to make money out of data. We still don't know exactly how monetization can work, because if Facebook was to distribute some of the money they make with my personal data, it would be like a very small amount of data. So it would not even be cost effective to just pay Andrea for the data that that is being used. But we'll find that way. It just we don't know. Maybe through groups. Maybe data that is not distributed to Andrea particularly. That or maybe money is not distributed directly to me as a consequence of in exchange of my data being used, but maybe to hospitals or schools in my district, or maybe to less privileged communities. But data governance, in all this conversation about data and technology, I think data governance will be the main game changer, more frankly than dismantling Facebook's or any other company. I think it's going to be about a fair way of using data. Back to the idea of data being the 21st century oil. it's more that it's the democratization of accessibility to that oil.
Well, it looks like we are at time now. Thank you, Andre, so much for coming on to this show to talk about such important things. I mean, this is something that is absolutely crucial to discuss, whether it be discipline related to the built environment or not. It's relevant in every sphere of conversation. And thank you for all the work you do and for coming on to talk to us.
Sure. Thank you for this very, very critical and challenging and very open question. This is almost like a sci-fi series of really looking forward to ways of making the world a better place for all of us. And I would elect the fight against inequality and all that comes with it, or all that causes it, corruption being one of them, as one of our main goals. If I had to summarize the 17 SDGs in one, I would start there.
Well, your mind definitely works in a very interesting way, and I'm happy that we were able to learn your perspective on some things, especially given everything Mia has said about how much she loved your class. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you all. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.